The land between two rivers. An introduction. Iraq sits cradled between two of history's most storied rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. For thousands of years, the waters of these rivers have given life to the land, shaping not just its geography, but its destiny. This is the ancient land of Mesopotamia, a place often called the cradle of civilization, and its economic story is as long and dramatic as any on Earth. It is a story that begins with the simple but revolutionary act of planting a seed in fertile soil, an act that unleashed a chain of events that would change humanity forever. This innovation allowed for the creation of food surpluses, which in turn freed people from the daily struggle for sustenance and allowed them to specialize. They became priests, soldiers, traders, kings, building the world's first cities and empires upon a foundation of agricultural wealth. This long economic journey is one of incredible highs and devastating lows. From the bustling markets of ancient Sumer to the grand intellectual and commercial hub of Abbasid Baghdad, this land has been a center of immense prosperity and innovation. It has also endured the ruin of invasions, the stagnation of empires, and the crippling weight of modern conflict. The story of Iraq's economy is a transition from an agrarian powerhouse, whose wealth was measured in bushels of wheat and barley, to a modern petrostate, whose fortunes rise and fall with the global price of oil. It is a powerful lesson in how geography, innovation, conflict, and resources can forge the economic fate of a nation over millennia. A story of immense wealth, profound loss, and the resilient struggle to rebuild. The dawn of economy, from farming to first cities. The story of the Iraqi economy begins in the mud and silt of the riverbanks, thousands of years before the first lines of history were written. In this fertile crescent, early humans made a monumental leap from hunting and gathering to settled agriculture. They learned to domesticate wheat, barley, they learned to raise sheep and goats, and most importantly, to manage the life-giving but unpredictable waters, the Tigris and the Euphrates, through irrigation canals. This agricultural revolution was the single most important economic event in prehistory. For the first time, communities could produce more food than they immediately needed. A surplus. That surplus was the bedrock upon which civilization was built. It freed a portion of the population to pursue activities other than farming. With a surplus of grain came the need for new systems. People had to build granaries to store the food. They had to develop methods to distribute it, and create ways to defend it. This led to the rise of a priestly class who managed the temple storehouses. These temples collected grain as offerings, and as taxes. They paid laborers in rations of barley and oil. Simultaneously, specialization flourished. Potters created vessels to hold food and water. Metallurgists forged tools from copper, and later bronze. Builders erected monumental structures like the Ziggurats. This division of labor created a more complex, interdependent society, laying the groundwork for the world's first urban centers, like Uruk around 3500 BCE. Empires of bronze and iron, Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians. The era of independent city-states gave way to empires, reorganizing the region's economy. Around 2334 BCE, Sargon of Akkad launched conquests uniting Sumerian cities. Sargon's political unification had profound economic consequences. Sargon standardized taxes, weights, and measures. That standardization streamlined trade and made central revenue collection easier. The Akkadian Empire controlled key trade routes, protecting caravans carrying timber. This created economies of scale and extended Mesopotamian commercial power. Centuries later, Babylon rose under Hammurabi around 1750 BCE. Hammurabi's legal code focused heavily on economic rules, contracts, regulating wages for laborers, setting interest rates for loans, establishing penalties for commercial fraud. These laws reduced risks in trade and investment. Merchants organized into guilds. State projects like canal expansion boosted agricultural productivity that supported growing cities. The empire's wealth rested on intensive farming and regulated commerce. The Assyrian Empire, c. 900–600 BCE, perfected the military economic model. Assyria used its army as economic policy, securing resources like iron, horses, silver. They built royal roads and way stations to move armies, messengers, taxable goods quickly. Conquered territories paid heavy tribute in raw and finished goods. Cities like Nineveh stored wealth from across the Near East. Each empire built on previous economic foundations. They managed the Tigris-Euphrates agricultural surplus to project power. After Assyria fell, the Persians, Hellenistic Seleucids took over. Mesopotamia stayed a vital crossroads. It linked the Mediterranean with Persia, India, beyond, the precursor to the Silk Road. Yeah, you can see how the layers build. The Golden Age of Baghdad, a global center of commerce. Following the rise of Islam in the 7th century, the region's economic center shifted. In 762 CE, the Abbasids founded Madinat al-Salam, the city of peace, better known as Baghdad, on the west bank of the Tigris. With canals linking it to the Euphrates, Baghdad was designed as a global hub of power and commerce. Its famous round city walls enclosed palaces, mosques, sprawling markets, souks. Merchants came from China, India, Africa, Scandinavia. For centuries it was arguably the richest and most intellectually vibrant city. The Abbasid economy was sophisticated and dynamic. Prosperity was fueled by agriculture. Ancient canals were repaired and expanded, sugarcane, rice, citrus fruits. But the true engine of its wealth was trade. Baghdad was the nexus of a vast commercial network. Caravans arrived with silk, spices, porcelain. Ships sailed down the Persian Gulf with dates, textiles, fine metalwork. To handle this volume, a complex financial system emerged. Merchants used letters of credit, suftajas, and checks, sak. These let them transfer large sums without carrying gold, a precursor to modern banking. At the heart of Baghdad's life was the House of Wisdom, Bait al-Hikmah. Scholars from diverse backgrounds gathered there, translating Greek works into Arabic, translating Persian works, translating Indian works. This was not just academic, it had direct economic applications, knowledge in mathematics, astronomy, engineering, innovations in navigation, irrigation, manufacturing. The development of algebra provided tools for calculating inheritance, and for commerce. Advances in papermaking from China made books and records cheaper and widespread. For over 4 centuries, Baghdad proved the power of trade, knowledge, and tolerant urbanism. Living standards were high. Public hospitals, libraries, a vibrant consumer culture. Workshops produced perfumes, glassware, fine silks, paper. This golden age showed how strategic location mattered. State investment in infrastructure, state investment in knowledge, and a dynamic merchant class. Baghdad wasn't just a political capital, it was the world's marketplace, and its university, all rolled into one magnificent city. The magnificent prosperity of Abbasid Baghdad came to a sudden and brutal end. In 1258, a Mongol army led by Hulagu Khan swept across Mesopotamia, laying siege to Baghdad. After the city surrendered, the Mongols unleashed massive destruction. They systematically dismantled the city, burning grand libraries, including the House of Wisdom. They turned palaces to rubble. They destroyed the intricate irrigation canals that sustained agriculture. Hundreds of thousands were killed, and the economic devastation was total. The sack of Baghdad was a civilizational blow for centuries. In the aftermath, Iraq entered a long economic decline. Canal destruction caused salinization of the soil. Fertile farmland turned to barren waste. Agricultural output collapsed. Population shrank from famine and disease. Trade routes shifted northward, bypassing the region. Successive Mongol successor states and Turkic dynasties did little to help. Political instability and lack of investment prevented rebuilding. The land that had been the world's breadbasket struggled to feed itself. In the 16th century, the region became part of the Ottoman Empire. For 400 years, the provinces were remote, often neglected, caught between the Ottomans and Safavid Persia. The economy was agrarian and pastoral. Dates, grain, raising sheep. The Ottomans ruled through provincial administrators and taxed the land. Major investment was rare. Once great cities were reduced to provincial towns and stagnated. The dynamism of the Abbasid era was a distant memory. In the late 19th century, small changes appeared under Tanzimat reforms. Steamships began navigating the Tigris. A telegraph line linked Baghdad to Istanbul. Some land tenure and administration reforms were attempted. European powers, especially Britain, increased commercial and strategic interest. German and British engineers surveying for a Berlin-Baghdad railway noted seeps of crude oil bubbling to the surface, dark sticky pools of oil, a harbinger of a new economic era. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire fundamentally redrew the map of the Middle East and set Iraq on a new economic trajectory. The former Ottoman provinces of Mosul, Baghdad, Basra were combined into a new political entity under a British mandate, driven largely by one strategic consideration: oil. British geologists and political agents had long suspected that the region held vast petroleum reserves. Securing control was a paramount goal as the Navy converted from coal to oil. The new state of Iraq was thus born, with its economic destiny intertwined with Great Britain and the burgeoning global petroleum industry. The suspicions of oil wealth were spectacularly confirmed on October 14, 1927. At a drilling site named Baba Gurgur, near the city of Kirkuk, a drilling crew from the Turkish Petroleum Company, a consortium of British, French, American interests, struck oil. The gusher that erupted was so powerful that it roared 140 feet into the air and took over a week to bring under control, flooding the surrounding landscape with crude oil. This single discovery confirmed that Iraq was sitting on a world-class oil field. The find immediately accelerated the construction of infrastructure needed to exploit this resource, leading to the development of pipelines that would carry Kirkuk's oil westward to ports on the Mediterranean Sea. As Iraq moved toward formal independence in 1932, its economy was already beginning a monumental shift. For millennia, wealth had been tied to land and water, the agricultural output of the river valleys. Now, a new source of subterranean wealth was poised to dominate. The revenues from oil exports, which began in earnest in the mid-30s, started to flow into the royal government's coffers. While agriculture remained the largest employer for decades, oil quickly became the most important source of state income and foreign exchange. This new money funded the beginnings of a modern state apparatus, national army, a civil service, and modest investments in infrastructure like roads and railways, often built to service the needs of the oil industry. This new oil economy, however, created a dual structure. On one hand, the modern, capital-intensive, foreign-dominated oil sector, highly profitable, but employing relatively few Iraqis. On the other hand, the traditional agricultural sector employed the vast majority of the population, but remained largely impoverished and underdeveloped. The wealth from oil did not automatically translate into broad-based development. The terms of the oil concessions were highly favorable to the foreign companies, giving the Iraqi government only a small fraction of the profits. This tension would come to define the political and economic struggles of Iraq for the rest of the 20th century. The post-World War II era saw a dramatic acceleration in Iraq's oil production, but popular discontent grew over the monarchy's perceived subservience to Western interests and over the inequitable distribution of oil revenues. This simmering anger culminated in the 14th of July Revolution of 1958. The monarchy was overthrown, and a republic was declared. A new government led by military officers with nationalist and leftist leanings took power. They promised to use the nation's oil wealth for the benefit of all Iraqis. They initiated ambitious land reform programs to break up large feudal estates. They embarked on state-led industrialization to diversify the economy. The revolution marked a decisive break with the past, and a claim that Iraq's resources would serve Iraqi interests. Through the 1960s, successive governments, including the Ba'ath Party after 1968, moved to assert control over oil. In June 1972, the Iraqi government nationalized the Iraq Petroleum Company. In 1973, OAPEC launched an oil embargo after the Yom Kippur War. Global oil prices quadrupled. Iraq, now in full control of production, benefited from perfect timing. Oil revenues jumped from about $1.8 billion in 1972 to over $26 billion by 1980. That influx of petrodollars fueled the 1970s oil boom, massive economic expansion, and social transformation. The Ba'athist state poured billions into a nationwide development program. It built modern highways, it built ports, it built a new electricity grid, it established steel industries, it built cement plants, it expanded petrochemical production. Most significantly, the state created a comprehensive welfare system. Primary education was made free, universities were made free, A nationwide literacy campaign reduced illiteracy, healthcare was made free, new hospitals were constructed, clinics were built across the country. For a while, Iraq's rising per capita income and social indicators made it a regional development model. The oil boom reshaped society. A new educated middle class emerged, working in the expanding public sector. Living standards rose, with modern amenities becoming common. Jobs expanded in the public sector. Social services spread nationwide. The population grew from about 9.5 million in 1970 to over 13.5 million by 1980. The state became almost wholly dependent on oil. Revenues made up over 95% of income. That dependence made prosperity fragile, and that vulnerability would be brutally exposed in the decades that followed. The prosperity of the 1970s came to an abrupt and devastating end with the outbreak of the Iran-Iraq War in September 1980. The 8-year conflict was ruinous for the Iraqi economy. The regime diverted its vast oil revenues from development projects to military expenditures, spending an estimated $100 billion on the war effort. Iraq plunged deep into debt, borrowing heavily from Kuwait, Saudi Arabia. The war caused direct physical damage to critical economic infrastructure, including oil terminals in the Persian Gulf, refineries, industrial plants. The conflict halted the country's economic progress, then reversed it, consuming its wealth and mortgaging its future. By the war's end, in 1988, Iraq was left with massive debts and a battered economy. Seeking a way out of its economic crisis and accusing Kuwait of driving down oil prices and stealing oil from a shared field, Iraq invaded its smaller neighbor in August 1990. The international response was swift and decisive. The United Nations Security Council imposed the most comprehensive economic sanctions ever seen, severing Iraq from the global economy. This was followed by the 1991 Gulf War, a massive air and ground campaign led by a US-led coalition that liberated Kuwait. The bombing campaign inflicted catastrophic damage on Iraq's infrastructure, destroying bridges, power plants, water treatment facilities, and communication networks. The combined impact of the war and the sanctions sent the Iraqi economy into a complete freefall. The 1990s were a lost decade for Iraq, a period of profound economic and humanitarian crisis under the weight of the UN sanctions regime. Barred from legally exporting its oil, the state lost its primary source of revenue. The country's GDP plummeted by an estimated 75% in the immediate aftermath of the 1991 war. Hyperinflation destroyed savings, and the government was forced to slash public services and resort to printing money. Living standards collapsed, malnutrition became widespread, and child mortality rates soared as the country was unable to import adequate food, medicine, and equipment to repair its shattered water and sanitation systems. What was once a middle-income country rapidly descended into poverty and desperation. In 1996, the UN established the Oil for Food program as a humanitarian concession. This allowed Iraq to sell a limited amount of oil on the world market, with the revenue held in a UN-controlled escrow account to be used strictly for purchasing food, medicine, and other essential civilian supplies. While the program alleviated the worst of the famine conditions, it was a far cry from a functioning economy. It institutionalized Iraq's dependence and did little to rebuild the country's productive capacity. By the dawn of the 21st century, the Iraqi economy was a shell of its former self, crippled by 2 devastating wars and a decade of the most stringent international sanctions in modern history. The 2003 US-led invasion that toppled Saddam Hussein's regime ushered in another tumultuous chapter for the Iraqi economy. The invasion itself caused further damage to infrastructure, but the most severe economic harm came from the subsequent breakdown of law and order. Widespread looting, sabotage of oil pipelines, and a violent insurgency crippled economic activity and deterred investment. While the end of UN sanctions theoretically opened Iraq to the global economy, the pervasive insecurity meant that a true recovery was impossible. Billions of dollars in international aid and reconstruction funds flowed into the country, but much of it was lost to corruption or failed to translate into tangible improvements in public services due to the chaotic security environment and a weak institutional capacity. Despite the violence, the one bright spot for the Iraqi state's finances was the dramatic rise in global oil prices during the mid to late 2000s. As security gradually improved enough to allow for the partial rehabilitation of the oil sector, production and exports began to climb. With oil prices reaching unprecedented highs, Iraq's nominal GDP rebounded spectacularly, growing from around $32 billion in 2003 to over $234 billion by 2012. This oil windfall once again filled government coffers, but the underlying economy remained broken. The non-oil sectors, particularly agriculture, manufacturing, continued to languish. The country became heavily reliant on imports for everything from food to consumer goods, and unemployment, especially among the youth, remained stubbornly high. The next major shock came in 2014 when the extremist group ISIS seized nearly a third of the country, including its second-largest city, Mosul. The conflict with ISIS dealt another severe blow to the economy. It displaced millions of people, destroyed entire cities, and disrupted oil production in the north. This coincided with a sharp crash in global oil prices, creating a dual crisis for the Iraqi government, which saw its revenues collapse just as its military expenditures soared. After a brutal 3-year war, Iraqi forces, with international support, reclaimed all territory from ISIS. By the end of 2017, the country was left with a monumental reconstruction bill, estimated to be nearly $90 billion, and a deeply traumatized population. As Iraq moves through the 2020s, its economy remains caught in a familiar cycle. Its fortune is overwhelmingly tied to the volatile price of oil, which still accounts for over 90% of government revenue. At over 40 million people, its population continues to grow, placing immense pressure on a job market and public services that have never fully recovered from decades of conflict. The nation's vast oil reserves, among the top 5 largest in the world, offer immense potential wealth. However, the story of the last 50 years is a stark illustration of the resource curse, the paradox where vast natural resource wealth leads not to stable prosperity, but to institutional decay, conflict, and economic volatility. Iraq's future rests on its ability to finally break this cycle and use its oil wealth to build a diversified, resilient, and inclusive economy. The choice between repeating the past and building a new future is the defining challenge for this ancient land.